It all began with something so seemingly insignificant that I still find it hard to believe how it managed to unravel everything. I was in the living room, folding clothes as usual, when Jake called out from the hallway, "Lorraine, can you help me with this?" I turned to see him standing at the steps, struggling with his belt buckle. He was wearing khaki shorts that hung loosely on his hips, and the leather strap of his belt was twisted uncomfortably. "Can you repair it?" he asked. "It's stuck or something." As he walked over to me, I said, "Sure," and laid the folded towels aside. I moved closer, reaching for the belt, attempting to disentangle the strap from the clasp. "It's an old belt," I muttered, focusing on the task at hand. "Yeah, sorry," he said, holding his breath as I worked. But as I yanked on the leather, the buckle suddenly gave way, and before either of us could react, his shorts slid down to his ankles. In that moment, the world seemed to freeze. My gaze involuntarily darted downward for a brief instant, and an uncontrollable impulse surged through me. I quickly averted my eyes, but that split-second image was seared into my mind. Jake stood there, his hands hovering awkwardly, and his face turning crimson. "Ah, sorry," he murmured before immediately tugging his shorts back up. I stepped back, my cheeks burning, stuttering, "That's okay. These things happen." "Yes," he said, his voice strained. "Thank you for your help." He then turned and dashed upstairs, leaving me standing there, my pulse racing and my mind reeling. It had been nothing more than an accident, a brief moment of embarrassment. However, the electric energy that filled the room and the way his gaze lingered on mine as he walked away changed something between us. We never talked about it, but from that day on, our relationship was never the same. My marriage to Alan was not a typical love story. It wasn't a bad one either. It was more of a peaceful, cozy arrangement that had gradually lost its warmth over the years. We got married when I was 44 and he was 50. We were both coming out of unsuccessful first marriages. Alan had his habits and hobbies. He played golf on Saturdays, went fishing once a month, and had an endless cycle of client dinners that kept him out late most of the time. I had learned to accept the silences as part of our life together, filling my days with charity work, gardening, and housework. Then Jake moved in. He was Alan's son from his previous marriage. Jake had always been polite, but somewhat aloof towards me. In the early years of my marriage, I had only seen him a few times during compulsory holiday visits when he was still in college. Back then, it was understandably awkward when young guys are forced to share a house with their new stepmothers. But 6 years later, the man who showed up at our door was not the shy adolescent I remembered. Jake had just graduated and was trying to find his place in the world. His degree was in fine arts, something Alan still scoffed at, and it hadn't led to immediate success. So Alan offered him a place to stay until he got things sorted out. I wasn't consulted about this, but I didn't object either. The house was big enough to accommodate him, and I didn't mind having some company during Alan's long days at work or with his friends. What I hadn't expected was how quickly Jake's presence would change the atmosphere in the house. He seemed a bit uncomfortable at first, but he possessed a natural charm that drew people in. His sense of humor was dry yet disarming, and his smile was contagious. His presence filled the empty rooms in a way that Alan's never did. It started with simple moments. One morning, I was trimming the bushes in the backyard when Jake came out with a cup of coffee. He was barefoot and still a bit disheveled from sleep. He leaned against the patio door, grinning lazily as he watched me work. "You awake early," I commented, looking at him. He shrugged and took a sip of his coffee. "Couldn't sleep. Besides, someone has to admire all the effort you're putting in out here." I chuckled quietly and shook my head. "Don't let Alan hear you say that." He thinks this garden takes care of itself. Jake said casually yet pointedly. Alan doesn't notice much. Although his remark surprised me, I chose not to question him about it. Instead, I continued pruning, painfully aware of his eyes fixed on me. Over the weeks, our conversations grew longer, and our interactions established a regular rhythm in the house. Jake would hang out in the kitchen while I cooked, sharing anecdotes about his college days or asking for advice on job applications. One day, I found him stretched out on the living room couch, doodling in a notebook. "Do you mind if I have a look?" I asked, nodding towards the pad. He paused for a moment before handing it to me. The pages were filled with exquisite pencil doodles, portraits, landscapes, and abstract patterns that seemed to come alive with movement. "These are amazing," I said sincerely. "Thank you," he murmured quietly. "It's just something I do to pass the time." I told him, "You should show these to someone. A gallery or an artistic director. Jake, you have real talent." He gave a small smile as our eyes met. "You're the first one to say that." The weight of his words hung in the air, and I felt a strange pang of something I couldn't quite define. Then came the belt incident, and everything changed. For several days after that, the air between us seemed charged, heavy with an underlying tension that neither of us knew how to handle. I tried my best to avoid being alone with him, but it was futile. The house was too quiet, and there were too many opportunities for us to cross paths. One evening, Jake entered the kitchen while I was doing the dishes. His hair was still damp from a shower. He spoke softly, "Lorraine." The way he said my name made my pulse quicken. "Yes?" I replied, my voice a bit unsteady. He hesitated, his hands tucked into the pockets of his pants. "I apologize for the embarrassing situation the other day." "It's all right," I said hastily, turning back to the washbasin. "Let's forget about that." "I'm not sure I can," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, the gravity of his words sinking in. Slowly, I turned to face him, my chest tight with conflicting feelings. "Jake, we can't," I began, but I wasn't sure how to continue. He moved closer, his stare unwavering. "I know, but I don't want you to think it meant nothing to me." His voice was so intense that I couldn't speak. For a while, neither of us moved. Then Alan's voice rang out from the front door, breaking the spell. "I'll be right there," I said hurriedly, moving away from Jake. But even as I walked away, I knew that something had changed between us, something that could not be undone. The days that followed were a jumble of avoidance and brief, charged looks. Despite Alan's ignorance, he spent his nights watching television or hanging out with friends, leaving Jake and me to navigate the complex situation we had created. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry in the guest room, Jake appeared at the doorway. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice uncertain. I paused before nodding. "Close the door," I said. He walked in and shut the door behind him. "I'm not sure how to act around you anymore," he said, his voice rough. "Jake, we need to let this go," I said, my voice trembling. "It was just a second, but it wasn't just that for a minute," he explained, getting closer. "At least not for me." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I allowed myself to accept the reality. It was more than just a moment for me too. There's a point when you realize you're about to cross a line, and there's no turning back. I knew it the first time Jake kissed me. Nothing about this was ever meant to happen. It occurred late one evening after Alan had gone to one of his golf mates' poker sessions. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the countertops, when Jake walked in. "Can't sleep?" I asked, looking at him. "Something like that," he murmured, leaning against the door. He was barefoot, his hair was untidy, and his stance made my chest tighten. We stood there in silence for a minute, the only sound being the gentle hum of the refrigerator. When I finally looked up, the intensity of his gaze left me speechless. "Lorraine," he added quietly, stepping forward. "Jake, don't," I muttered, even as my heart raced. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said softly and steadily. "You have to," I said, my voice quivering. "This is wrong. You know this." "I know," he murmured, narrowing the gap between us. "But that doesn't change how I feel." Then he kissed me. It was tentative at first, as if he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When I finally pulled back, my heart was pounding, and I couldn't meet his gaze. "This can't happen again," I murmured, barely audible. He nodded, but the expression in his eyes told me he didn't believe it. Neither did I. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and silent anguish. We tried to pretend that nothing had changed, but the tension between us was too strong to ignore. Every glance and accidental touch felt electrifying, weighted down by the unspoken words between us. Alan remained blissfully unaware, his focus divided between his job, friends, and numerous interests. Despite his preoccupation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were risking everything. The second time it happened was in the garden. I had been trimming the roses all morning, the warm sun beating down on my back, when Jake came up behind me. "You're always out here," he murmured. "It's peaceful," I said without looking around. He took a step closer, casting his shadow over me. "I guess you like avoiding me," he said. My breath caught, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." "Don't you?" he asked, his voice quiet yet urgent. I turned to face him, and my chest tightened as I caught his eyes. This time, there was no hesitation, no way to talk myself out of it. He kissed me again, and I kissed him back. What started as fleeting moments gradually turned into something neither of us could control. We were cautious at first, seeking out quiet areas of the house where we wouldn't be disturbed. But the more time we spent together, the more confident we became. One evening while Alan was at a client dinner, Jake and I ended up in the library. I was pretending to tidy the shelves, my hands trembling as he stood behind me. "You're shaking," he said softly, his breath warm on my neck. "I'm okay," I responded, but my voice betrayed me. He placed his hands on my shoulders and turned me to face him. "You don't need to be scared," he whispered. "I'm not scared of you," I whispered back. "I'm scared of what we are doing." He cradled my face in his palms and held my gaze. "Then don't think about it. Just be with me." I wanted to fight, to tell him that we couldn't keep doing this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let him take me into his arms, and for the first time in years, I felt a rush of energy. The secrecy of our relationship only made it more intense. Every stolen minute felt like a rebellion against the life I had settled for, a reminder that passion still existed and that longing could be hidden behind the monotony of my marriage. But with the joy came fear. One afternoon, as Jake and I were sitting on the living room couch, Alan came home earlier than expected. "Lorraine," he called out from the hallway. I leaped up, my pulse racing, as Jake dashed to the other side of the room. "In here," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. Alan strolled in and glanced between us. "I had no idea you'd have company," he said, his tone nonchalant, but his gaze lingered on Jake. "Jake was just catching up," he replied, his stance relaxed. Alan nodded, but the look he gave me as he walked away sent chills down my spine. As careful as we were, it became increasingly difficult to hide. Alan started asking questions, initially subtle but gradually becoming sharper. "You and Jake seem to be getting along well," he said one evening as we sat at the dinner table. "He's been a great help around the house," I said, feigning a grin. Alan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad to see that. It's comforting to know someone is keeping you company while I'm working." His words were tinged with something I couldn't quite identify, and I felt the blood drain from my cheeks. The first serious breach came when Jake's best friend Grant showed up unexpectedly. Grant was outspoken, opinionated, and had a knack for picking up on what others tried to conceal. "You've been spending a lot of time at home," Grant said to Jake one afternoon, his tone light, but his eyes piercing. Jake replied nonchalantly, "Just helping out." "Must be nice," Grant remarked, his gaze shifting to me. "Having somebody to keep you company." The statement made me shudder, and I hurriedly excused myself, leaving the two of them alone. Later, Jake found me in the kitchen. His expression was stern. "Grant is guessing," I said, my voice wavering. Jake shook his head. "He's not stupid, Lorraine. He's going to figure things out." As the weeks passed, with Grant's comments and the weight of our secret, the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. It was like an approaching storm. However, as the risks increased, so did my feelings for Jake. And no matter how serious the situation got, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. Maintaining a secret is like trying to breathe underwater. You can only do it for so long before the strain becomes overwhelming. Jake and I were good at hiding, but the cracks in our facade were starting to show. Then there was Heather, Alan's colleague. Her casual visits became more and more intrusive with each passing week. She showed up unannounced one Saturday afternoon, entirely at ease. She had been to the house several times before, usually under the guise of dropping something off for Alan. This time, she came with a bottle of wine and an overly bright grin. She walked into the kitchen where I was cutting vegetables and said, "I thought I'd stop by. Alan said that you've been feeling a bit overloaded recently. I thought you could use a diversion." "I'm all right," I said with a forced smile. "But thank you." Heather set the bottle on the counter and leaned against the island, her gaze scanning the room, as if she were memorizing every detail. "This place is beautiful. You've done an excellent job making it feel like a home." "Thank you," I said firmly. Her eyes remained fixed on the back door where Jake had exited just minutes before. "Alan is lucky to have you. And Jake, of course. He's a great help around here, isn't he?" "Of course," I replied, my heart racing, but my demeanor remained calm. "He's been wonderful. It's nice to have him around." Heather's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I bet it is." Heather's presence became more frequent over time. She found excuses to drop by, usually pretending it was work-related, but her true intention was clear. She was looking for something. I couldn't tell if it was information or Alan himself. She mentioned one afternoon, as we sat in the living room, that Alan doesn't talk much about his personal life, but I get the impression that things haven't been great between you two. I tensed and gripped the teacup in my lap. "Every marriage has its problems," I said. "Oh, sure," Heather replied, her tone laced with false compassion. "But having Jake around really helps. He seems very attentive." The implication of her words was obvious, and I felt a wave of terror rise in my chest. Then there was Grant. Jake's closest friend had always been frank and sometimes a bit nasty, but his comments took on a harsher edge. "You've been spending a lot of time with Lorraine," Grant said to Jake one evening as they sat on the terrace, beers in hand. Jake shrugged, maintaining a casual tone. "She's my stepmother. Of course we talk." "Yeah, but it's not just that, right?" Grant pressed, looking at him intently. Jake's grip tightened on the beer bottle. What exactly are you trying to say? Grant said, I'm saying you're acting weird, and I don't think it's just because of me working. There's something more going on, and I think it has to do with her. Jake stood up suddenly, knocking his chair against the stone. You don't know what you're talking about. Grant's eyes narrowed. Don't I? The tension in the house grew unbearable. Every interaction with Alan felt like walking on thin ice. Every visit from Heather felt like an impending challenge. And Jake's frustration with our secret was mounting. One evening, as we sat in the library, he turned to me, his expression steely. I can't keep doing this, he said. Jake, we have to be careful, I said, my voice cracking. Careful isn't enough, he said. Grant is suspicious. Heather is snooping around. And Alan isn't as naive as you think. I looked away, tears welling up in the corners of my eyes. What do you suggest? That we stop. He moved closer, his voice softening. You know I can't do that. But we have to figure out what we are going to do, because this isn't sustainable. The breaking point came during a dinner party that Alan insisted on hosting. Heather was there, of course, as were a few of Alan's co-workers. Jake had invited Grant, who also showed up. The evening started innocently enough, with polite conversation, laughter, and the clinking of wine glasses. But as the night progressed, things took a turn. Lorraine, Heather said, her voice cutting through the chatter. How do you keep yourself busy with Alan away so often? I froze, her question rife with insinuation. The usual things, I replied, trying to keep my tone light. Gardening, reading, and helping Jake with various tasks. Heather's grin tightened. You must be really close now. Across the table, Grant raised an eyebrow, his eyes shifting to Jake. Yeah, Jake has been spending a lot of time here recently. I suppose it makes sense. Lorraine is fairly easy to talk to. The table fell silent, the weight of their words lingering in the air. Alan looked between us, his expression unreadable, while Heather sipped her wine, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Jake pushed his chair back forcefully. Excuse me, he mumbled before exiting the room. I think I'll go check on him, I said immediately, rising quickly before anyone could stop me. I found Jake in the yard, pacing in the soft glow of the patio lights. As I approached, he said, "This is a mistake." What was it? I asked, my heart pounding. All of it, he said, his voice thick with fury. Allowing Grant to come here, pretending everything is okay. Lorraine, it isn't okay. It's falling apart. I reached for him, my fingers brushing his arm. We'll work it out. He looked at me, his eyes full of despair. How? Because I'm running out of ways to hold this together. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps on the gravel made us both pause. I turned to see Alan standing at the edge of the garden, his face in shadow, but his posture rigid. What's going on out here? He asked, his voice low and threatening. We stood in silence for a few moments, the stillness deafening. My mind raced, searching for something to say to break the tension. Alan, I began, attempting a smile. We were just talking. He interrupted me, his tone stern. It's funny how you two seem to have so much to talk about these days. Jake straightened, his jaw clenching. Is there a problem, Alan? Alan twisted his lips into a cold grin. I'm not sure, Jake. Should there be? The weight of his words hit me like a punch in the gut, and I felt my breath catch. This was no longer just suspicion, he knew. I think I'll go inside, Jake said, his voice firm yet strained. No, Alan snapped, leaving no room for argument. You will stay right here. Jake paused but didn't move. Alan focused his attention on me, his eyes dark. Can you explain why my wife and my son are sneaking around in the yard during a dinner party? I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The tension rose as the seconds ticked by. The next day, Alan was colder than ever. His tone was clipped, and his frigid gaze made it clear that he wasn't going to let this go. Jake tried to keep his distance, but that only made things worse. Heather, of course, found a way to insert herself into the turmoil. I couldn't help but notice the uneasiness last night, she said as she sipped her coffee in the kitchen. It was just a misunderstanding, I explained, trying to keep my tone light. Heather inclined her head, her smile too sweet to be genuine. Of course. But Lorraine, you might want to be careful. Perceptions can be deadly, especially in this situation. Her remarks were a veiled threat, and I knew she was enjoying every moment of it. The real shock came later that evening. Alan called me into the study. His manner was calm yet unsettling. I've been thinking, he said, leaning back in his chair. Maybe it's time to make some changes. Changes? I asked cautiously. Jake has been here long enough, Alan continued, his tone nonchalant. I think it's time he moved on, found his own place. My heart sank. Alan was still figuring things out, and he wanted Jake to leave. Alan, this isn't up for discussion, he said sharply. Lorraine, this is what's going to happen. When I told Jake, he reacted explosively. Is he kicking me out? Jake said, his voice rising. Because of what? A chat in the yard. What does he think? Jake, I murmured, trying to stay calm. He's suspicious. He thinks what? Jake snapped. Is something going on? This is his problem, not ours. I put my hand on his arm, trying to soothe him. We knew this was a possibility, and we can't let it get worse. Jake shook his head, his jaw tightening. He's not doing this because he's suspicious. He's doing this to control you, and I'm not going to let him. The night Alan told Jake to leave was the beginning of the end. You have a week to pack your things, Alan said over dinner, his tone calm but forceful. Jake's fork clattered on his plate as he stood up quickly. You don't get to decide when I leave. This is my house too, he said, his voice cold. I will not put up with this anymore. What exactly are you putting up with, Jake? Alan shot back, his voice raised. I'm here, and I'm getting closer to Lorraine than you ever could. The room went silent, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Alan's face darkened as he stood, his words low and menacing. Get out of the house before I make you regret it. That night, I found Jake in his room. His bags were half-packed. You can't let him win, he murmured, his voice taut with rage. This isn't about winning, I explained, my voice quivering. This is about survival. He turned to face me, his eyes burning. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to stay with him. I shook my head, tears streaming down my cheeks. I have no choice. Jake stepped closer and said, There's always a choice. Come with me. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I let myself imagine leaving everything behind and starting anew somewhere far away. But the reality of what that would mean hit me hard, and I shook my head. I can't, I said, my voice cracking. Jake looked at me for a long time before nodding. Then I'll leave, he replied gently. But it's not over. Jake left the next morning. Alan didn't speak to me, and I spent the day wandering around the empty house, unnerved by the silence. But the biggest shock came that evening. I found a note pushed under my bedroom door. You think you've won, Alan, but you don't know the truth. I'll make sure you do. Heather. My hands trembled as I read the message, the implications sinking in. Heather knew something, and she was using it to her advantage. Heather's message weighed heavily on my mind. I stood in my bedroom, reading the words over and over until they blurred together. My first instinct was to confront her and demand to know what she thought she had on me. But the truth was, I already knew she had seen or heard enough to piece together something damning, and now she held all the power. The encounter happened 2 days later. Heather came over again, pretending to deliver some documents for Alan. I cornered her in the kitchen, my voice low and angry as I held up the note. "What's this?" I demanded, my hands shaking. Heather didn't even flinch. She leaned against the counter, a small smile on her lips. "It's exactly what it says. Do you think Alan deserves to know the truth?" "There's nothing to tell," I said hastily, though my voice wavered. Heather raised an eyebrow, her expression full of false sympathy. "Lorraine, you don't really believe that, do you? I've seen how you and Jake look at each other. I'm not blind." My chest tightened, and I moved closer, lowering my voice. "If you think you can use this to manipulate me, you're wrong. I won't let you destroy my family." Heather giggled quietly and shook her head. "Would you destroy your family, Lorraine? You already have. I'm just speeding up the inevitable." Before I could respond, Alan's voice echoed down the hallway, and Heather's smile grew. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll handle the timing." Alan was quieter than usual that evening, picking at his dinner with a tense expression. Heather had left hours before, but her presence lingered like a shadow over the house. I didn't know if she had said anything to him, but the silence between us was oppressive. Finally, Alan put his fork down and looked at me. "Lorraine, is there anything you want to tell me?" My heart stopped. I forced a smile, feigning uncertainty. "What do you mean?" Alan leaned back in his chair, his gaze narrowed. "You've been acting strangely lately, and then there's Heather, who hints at things I don't understand. If there's anything going on, now is the time to tell me." Panic welled up in my chest, but I managed to stay calm. "Alan, there's nothing going on. Heather is just trying to cause drama. You know how she is." Alan gave me a long look before nodding slowly. "I hope you're right," he said, his tone heavy with caution. "Because if I find out differently—" He didn't finish the statement, but he didn't have to. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing with possibilities. Heather's threat hung over me, and Alan's growing mistrust made every move I made feel like one step closer to disaster. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, my phone rang on the nightstand. I snatched it up, my pulse racing as I read the message. "Meet me tomorrow around noon in the park by the bridge. Jake." The next day, I left the house under the pretext of running errands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I drove to the park, my mind racing with what Jake could have to say. When I arrived, he was waiting at the bridge, his hands tucked inside his jacket pockets. "You shouldn't have contacted me," I murmured as I approached, my voice shaking. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his eyes dark with anger. "Heather came to see me." I inhaled sharply, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift. "She knows, Lorraine," he said in a quiet, worried tone. "She knows everything and is using it to get to Alan." My stomach churned. "What exactly did she say to you?" "She wanted me to confess," he said coldly. "To tell Alan the truth, Lorraine. She's playing us both." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on me. "We are running out of time," Jake said, reaching for my hand. His touch grounded me. Then we need to act before she does. This story has led us through a tumultuous journey of secrets, temptation, and the consequences of our actions. Now, consider these questions. What could Lorraine and Jake have done differently to avoid this situation? How did the actions and words of the other characters, like Alan and Heather, contribute to the escalating drama? What lessons can we learn about communication, boundaries, and the importance of honesty in relationships? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's have a conversation about the choices we make and how they can impact not only our own lives, but also the lives of those around us.